And he's like, yeah, let's get into it.
I don't know. I mean, this time period that we're going to go into today, and if you missed any of our other ones, we're calling these our study sessions with Matt Eric from the Rising Tide Foundation and the Canadian Patriot Review. I don't do it as good as V Gorilla, but I like to just, add a little something there.
But I'm boom.
Yeah, we've been doing it on peace, progress, and prosperity. And we started with the Silk Road. We went into Manifest Destiny, or the roots of Manifest Destiny, which was Franklin and Hamilton.
Right.
And we really focused on Lincoln last time. And then there's this, we were moving in toward the earlier 20th century. And just in going back and reviewing our last one, I realized that there were just some huge influences out of Lincoln's time that spread across the globe. And it obviously hit Russia, it hit Germany, Otto von Bismarck, it hit China. And I'd love for us to even get going with Sun Yat-sen and his influences. I mean, earlier today, I read a quote. Matter of fact, I'll read this quote, which is just so good. It says, society progresses through the adjustment of major economic interests rather than through the clash of interests, or what's known as class struggle. If most of the economic interests of society can be harmonized, the majority of people will benefit and society will progress. And that's a quote from Sun Yat-sen aimed at Karl Marx. And if I hadn't told you that, you would have thought that was Carey, maybe Lincoln, maybe Gilpin even. And no, it was Sun Yat-sen, who nobody in America knows, this Chinese old soul. I'm going to go as far to say he's a real old soul that was trying to bridge the gap between our nations at a time when it looked like a lot of other nations were on board. And I think that's just a good place to launch off.
That is a wonderful place to launch off into this discussion. And yeah, you guys, I'm really, really happy to have this back and forth with you over the course of, I guess this is the fourth or fifth session we've done, because there's a real nice tapestry forming. Each one is each discussion that we have has been a self-contained idea, which has blossomed nicely, but they work together as chapters in a greater whole. And the fact that you guys are so in tune and so knowledgeable of this core history too, it makes this very organic and nice. But you're zeroing in on just the right things. And indeed, what you just said about the spread of this particular science of political economy, which is really what it was understood to be back in the 19th century. Today, we tell people that, oh, you can either study political science or you can study economy. To be a political scientist, you might get lucky as a job as an advisor in a government or the civil service or like a think tank, or just teach political science. If you're an economist, you're going to definitely work in a bank, in the financial sector. You're going to be an expert in the numbers game, in knowing how to nudge and maybe manipulate, if anything, mass behavior in order, or at least predict mass behavior. The manipulation is supposed to be for the politicians, we're told, and the prediction of the irrational behavior of the herd is for the economists who are gambling on what they think the price commodities are going to be in the future, right? But either way, you don't really have a holistic sense that these are actually, you can't be an economist if you don't also understand statecraft, and vice versa. You can't be a statesman unless you really engage in a full understanding of economy. And that's what Lincoln was. And when you read the writings of Lincoln, his speeches, you read his advisor speeches, you look at the people who he was interfacing with internationally, as well as in Canada, South America. You brought up Otto von Bismarck and his networks in Germany or Russia or China. There was a deep understanding that this is something that was not free market money worshiping. It was not based upon the idea that you had to just, buy low, sell dear, and assume that there's hidden hands of the marketplace organizing order and creativity. You also didn't have to assume inversely that the Marxist theory of class struggle was right either. And that, you had to have some form of communistic type system where you get rid of property in order to have somehow justice, as if that was whoever proved that property's existence is the cause of injustice. That's a big assumption. So that dichotomy, which really screwed up the minds of a lot of people during the Cold War, because he had to pick a side, right? Be a
Right.
liberty-loving capitalist or be a totalitarian communist. Pick a side, and people like Lincoln didn't have that problem, and neither did Sun Yat-sen. So the fact that you've zeroed in on Sun Yat-sen, I think, is really important, especially in today's world, where people are very confused about China. What is animating China? Is it just another empire? Is it the thing controlling the Great Reset? Is it beholden to the Great Reset? Like, what is China? So there's so much confusion, and I think that comes down to the fact that we've been so miseducated about the past of U.S.-China relations going back to the 19th century and even earlier. People like, Ben Franklin formed a lot of his core concepts of government around studying the Confucianism. And he was the original publisher of Western Confucian tracts, the Analects, Mencius's writings in the United States, starting from the 1740s with his printing presses. His Poor Richard's Almanac was heavily inspired by his studies of Confucius. And in fact, every single one of the 13 items that he has in his articles of self-improvement embedded in his autobiography are directly found, except for one of them, in the works of Confucius, as well as civil service. So you already had that early on. Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, both very much inspired and moved by that. And go back to Ben Franklin. He even said, when somebody asked him, "What's your motive? What inspires you? Who do you?" He said, I'm trying to walk in the footsteps of Socrates, Jesus, and Confucius. That's my model. So there's something that's strong. And the fact that Sun Yat-sen was somebody who, for those who don't know, Sun Yat-sen is he's the first president of China. He's a revolutionary, a Republican. He's the one who organized for about 15 years or more what became the 1911 Republican Revolution of China that overthrew the older hereditary dynasty of the Manchus, the Chen. They overthrew the dynastic system of the Chang Empire. Well, I just blanked on the name of the dynasty. Anyway.
Yeah, but that was right around the time when those opium wars were going on, was when he was born into, right? 1840s, 50s, I think 50s maybe was.
Yeah, exactly. Well, 50s. And he was brought in as a young student. I might have been born in the 60s, actually, during the Civil War. But it was during 1878, I believe, that he found himself in studying in the United States. There was a network of American tutors, teachers who were part of this American system school in Hawaii that he found himself studying under with his brother. And China had been destroyed. They'd been really abused terribly by this Anglo-American opium war that really was targeted to destroy the spirit of the Chinese people and just destroy the danger of the rise of a Chinese dragon. That was always what the British Empire were afraid of. And their, fifth columnists inside of the United States that worked with the British to, stuff China with opium from India, after India itself was also crippled because they used to be the primary textile producer of the world, right? Which was destroyed by the British. And they were given, instead of textiles, they were given opium to grow, and that was fed to the Chinese. And the Indians basically had their own caste system encouraged by the British, so that they became a self-controlling system with an organized crime structure, a lot of Masonic type of hierarchy embedded within that. Same thing for China, and that's where things like the triads came out of. Was, they were groomed. The different sociopathic elements within China back in the 19th century were groomed by their British overlords. And essentially became self-controlling systems based out of Hong Kong, which became a British protectorate during the Opium Wars. And that had been the case for about a century after the Opium Wars were over, all the way until 1997. HSBC was a big British bank, which it's still a big influence in the Pacific and China today, and especially Hong Kong. HSBC was created in 1865. In the wake of the Opium Wars, as well as a drug bank to basically launder and funnel money for drugs into the Chinese system.
It was a City of London bank.
Yeah, it's a City of London bank. Yeah, people think, HSBC is everywhere, and I actually see a lot of right-wing conservatives who are commenting on the big bad Chinese, and I've seen this now dozens of times where they say, look at the influence of the HSBC bank in laundering drugs and providing drug profits and drugs into North America. isn't this obviously the Chinese revenge for the century of humiliation 100 years ago? It's like, no, you idiot. You think it's Chinese because it says Hong Kong, Shanghai? No, that's just a name. It's London based. It's a London bank that was always designed to destroy China. It was never Chinese. They even run today. Half of the Hong Kong currencies are printed by HSBC Bank. It's not even the Chinese, banking system that produces the Hong Kong bank's currency. So Sun Yat-sen studied Lincoln. He studied the American system. He studied the British system and how it subverted nations, utilizing the surface virtue of free trade, which on the surface sounds nice, until, of course, you introduce the reality of political agendas and power structures that are real, which don't play by the rules of the game that they want everybody else to follow. So free trade works if everybody is on a relatively equal playing field and everybody honestly wants to, be the best that they can be. Sure, having that type of open, no tariff competition, is fine. But the fact, as soon as you introduce the reality of the British East India Company, the City of London banking overlords that want to destroy you, well, and that's where it breaks down. And so people like Lincoln, like Sun Yat-sen, understood that. And the fact that the quote that you picked out had Sun Yat-sen making a point that it's not the class struggle, that is going to be animating our considerations. And he even pointed out in his 3 Principles of the People, a series of lectures towards the end of his life.
That's brilliant.
That Karl Marx, who was becoming embraced by many of the younger intelligentsia of China in the 1920s, he made the point very clearly that Karl Marx might have had some good critiques of imperialism, and you can't argue with the critiques as far as what he doesn't like. It's fine. But as soon as he tries to get across what you should do, things break down. You start having disobedience of the observable facts of reality and how wealth is actually created, and how you when we do things right, there's many instances of human beings having a coherence of interests, a harmony of interests, like Henry C. Carey called his book, between the producers, the workers, the entrepreneurs, the farmers, the industrialists. You don't have to have this society at war with itself under a class struggle where you have like these assumptions of rules of exploitation, the sucking up of wealth into a smaller and smaller coterie of landowners, while the masses of workers inevitably get poorer and more exploited to the point that they have to revolt and cut off the heads of their the people at the top in order to survive. That does happen too, but that's not to say that that's a law of nature is a big leap of an assumption, which is wrong. And Sun Yat-sen understood that, which is why he said Karl Marx might have been a social, how did he call it? He was able to diagnose social neurotic disorders, but to call himself a social psychiatrist or social scientist is wrong. And so in the 3 Principles of the People, which he outlines as the foundation upon which any Chinese nation or republic could ever exist and endure, he is very clear that it's premised on Lincoln's understanding of a government for, by, and of the people. And he outlines that thoroughly, that unless you actually satisfy each of those 3 principles of a government that exists for the benefit of the individual, but the individuals also are participating in the government as well, and that you have a social economy built up that always brings people to a higher state of productivity and happiness. Unless you have that government is not going to be long for this world. And he was a Christian on top of it. He was a Confucian and he was a Christian. So people today, they often say, oh, the Chinese and the Western worlds are totally incompatible. They're just 2 different paradigms. Yeah, no, I mean, the Eastern paradigm is incompatible with the Hobbesian imperial unipolar might makes right paradigm. That's true. But that's not Western. That's the oligarchical parasite that's destroying Western civilization. When you actually look at Western civilization insofar as it has renewed itself and given birth to higher degrees of progress, as we've themed our discussion series, you start seeing that no, there's actually something loving and good that is based upon the harmony of interest and the harmony of human beings, men and women, and the creator and the creative force that unites us in that participation, which is exactly what you see in the best of Buddhist, of Confucian, and of many other philosophies of the East. So there's a total coherence, which is also another irony. Today, both Taiwan celebrates Sun Yat-sen as a great hero, but also so does mainland China. Nanjing, where he was born, has a giant monument on mainland China celebrating his life. And so for a lot of Westerners, that's an important paradox to just let sit, because here is a Christian humanist follower of Lincoln who modeled what he wanted the best of China to be based on the best of what America was. But even further, he didn't want it to just be on America, because he could also see, and he wrote about the problems of America as well. He was able to see that there was an unresolved problem in 1776 that was never resolved even when he was writing in 1911, 12, 13. So he made the point that, look, the US is an unfinished product. It's still trying to find itself. And we as the Chinese have to go even further, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Take the best of what America has given us. Yeah. And the idea of might makes right being inferior to right makes might is another theme he plays with his entire life. He's always writing this. So yeah, very important guy.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because Alexander II, he was right in there, obviously, as we talked a bit about last time with Lincoln. And then when they finally were able to assassinate him, you started to see some of these different key figures be eliminated from the game, basically, right? From the chessboard. Literally, it's kind of funny when you go up against the imperialists. They have no problem assassinating, where we tend to, I don't know, appease and try to play their game maybe better than they play it. And obviously that's up for debate if that's the best approach to the elites, but it's just interesting, right? Like that has played out in history so many times, all these different countries coming together, and little by little, like Bismarck just got marginalized. They didn't have to actually kill him. They just demoted him, from what I understand. And even Sun Yat-sen, when he had that position, he deferred it, it looked like. And it took a little bit before the nationalist republic mindset in China was able to retake control. Before then, years later, in 49, when the CCP took back over. So that's an interesting, I'm curious what you would say about that early time, though, when Sun Yat-sen deferred that position, was it 1911 or 12 there?
Yeah, I mean, there was the problem with China is that it was the revolution of 1911 involved a revolution of a process that was highly contaminated. There was not a lot to work with within the institutions, within the civil service. It was pure corruption bred and created by generations of British controlled systems of corruption through opium and other things. So there wasn't really there were some better people within the civil service, but not very many. It was really rotten to the core. You had a system of warlords. So the whole society was run in a feudalistic type of fashion, with warlords having jurisdiction over all sorts of districts, who wielded a lot of power. It was a nation very divided. And most importantly, the population, the citizenry, were not citizens. There were people who were themselves very abused, kind of like the French Revolutionary situation of the 1789 period. Unlike the United States, right? Why did the French Revolution fail where the American Revolution succeeded? It had a lot to do with the cultural development, where the American farmers had a culture of reading themselves, of literacy, of reading Latin and ancient Greek, and they could read the Bible themselves. They could read the classics, and they could think about the higher ideas. So that literacy created a platform for the soul to have access to the higher concepts that are not easy to grapple with, but that you need to, if you're going to become a sovereign citizenry, understanding why I should take a sacrifice or risk my career, my life, my family, even for the sake of an ideal like freedom. Right. That's not easy. So it takes, and the pamphleteering society of people like Thomas Paine, Ben Franklin, who were helping to encourage the blossoming of that type of cultural sharpness was absent in France. In France, it was a society of largely illiterate serfs who, because of their good people, but because of the lack of cultural development, they were much more easily herded and turned into weaponizable mobs.
Yeah.
So,
so basically, Sun Yat-sen had a similar problem with his population
That we're kind of seeing now.
right? I mean, like he was in it too for decades before that point, just
Yeah.
battling so much corruption, but also a lot of like colonialism, really, or what would be. I guess it's a little different when you got warlords over
Yeah.
you, but it's similar. You know, it's a
yeah, I mean, these warlords were not in it for
Right.
the greater good, you know,
Right,
and again, you had to negotiate with them, though. That's the thing. If you were going to be able to, in real politics, you have to find yourself basically negotiating and trying to share power or manage things with people who are dishonest, who are corrupt, selfish little people, because they happen to be in a position of power. And he did that. So even though he was president for, I think, the month or two, he had to, in order to keep things moving ahead and to keep the whole republic from disintegrating before it even got off the ground, he basically had to give up the presidency, and he gave it to a big warlord that he had collaborated with as far as getting rid of the hereditary structures. But that warlord, whose name is escaping me, I didn't realize we were going to talk about that. So
I know.
That's okay.
I forget his name too, though.
It's on the tip of my tongue, but he ended up signing an agreement with the British, and he basically wanted to set himself up as a new emperor, which kind of really ran contrary to the whole ideal of having a republic to begin with.
Yeah, it went south quick.
It went south super fast. So, Sun Yat-sen worked as hard as he could, especially on the cultural level, organizing the young people and the people who had an openness to the higher ideas. And luckily, this warlord wannabe emperor failed in his endeavor. But he failed not without the help of the British. The British Empire was doing everything possible to ensure he would succeed. I don't know the full story. I'd have to review some things.
That's a rich story.
But all that to say, when it came down to the 1920s, at that point, you had at that point the World War I had already transpired. 1919 was the destructive Treaty of Versailles that was designed to really annihilate Germany specifically. Because, ultimately Germany, this is way before Nazism, right? Nazism wasn't even really a thing.
Right.
Germany, the real reason why World War I was orchestrated was because Germany was too much in alignment with the Lincoln American system orientation to political economy.
Right.
And that's a fact. People like Otto von Bismarck were applying the Friedrich List political economic reforms that apply to protectionism back in the 1840s. It started where Germany, which was a very broken up society with little local dukedoms and fiefdoms, and there wasn't really a unified German identity. Right. That was finally ended with the application of this one-man army, Friedrich List, who had studied in the United States. He came in with Marquis de Lafayette in 1826 and stayed for 5 years studying Alexander Hamilton's system, and he brought it back. And how did America survive those early precarious years when it was a divided nation? All 13 colonies were fighting amongst themselves. He created, as we've talked about in the past, he basically created a federal one national debt, got rid of the local state debts, created a national bank, created the basis upon which an entire protective tariff could be created, but free trade could finally be enjoyed amongst the states themselves. Because before that, you had no ability to not only raise a tariff for imports of goods that were coming in or flooding your market by the British. So you couldn't raise a tariff. If you did have a tariff in one of the states, you couldn't even collect it. You couldn't collect taxes. You couldn't have a government. You couldn't have a standing army to protect yourself. So the U.S. was really done for, and it was unbearably bankrupt, and it had no industry. It had no means of production, which is key, right? So if you're going to be able to pay off your debt, you have to be able to produce abundance. To produce abundance, you can't just stick with sharecropping, monoculture. You got to be able to have a full spectrum economy. You need to have high-tech science and industry. That's what Hamilton brought to the table. So that's what Friedrich List studied, which was brought back and applied, especially with the idea of internal improvements. So infrastructure animating the emission of credit through state banks for, increasing the productive powers. Rail was the key thing that worked in the United States. It was done in Germany too. And that was called the Zollverein. So it was done so well that Germany started outproducing the British Empire in almost everything by the end of the 19th century. And Otto von Bismarck was one of the biggest proponents of this.
That's so cool.
Now, Otto von Bismarck, as you pointed out, he wasn't assassinated. He was one of the few such statesmen who didn't get assassinated because there was a big list. It's like we're talking well over 25 leading presidents, Sidi Carnot, and two czars, and so many more foreign ministers, interior ministers of Russia. It's a big list. We've got 3 presidents during this time, right?
Right.
So Otto von Bismarck didn't get assassinated, but he did have a very little chancellor, or not chancellor, a Kaiser, sort of the German czar,
Right.
Wilhelm.
Wilhelm.
Huh?
Wilhelm.
Wilhelm. And Wilhelm had a big ego, really like pompous regalia, and he had a lot of courtiers around him on the payroll of the British who were whispering little bits of poison into his ears about how this Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor Bismarck, wants to have all the power for himself. You're getting no respect because everybody just respects Otto von Bismarck, and he's taken away the light from your star. And this worked him, and it worked him hard for a few years. And in fact, there's a similar, and he ended up firing Bismarck in 1890. And at that point, without Bismarck in the game, all of the backdoor maneuvers that had been done for 20 plus years by Bismarck to keep the peace, especially between Germany and Russia, was gone. And you only had doofuses and fools who were then filling the vacuum, where Germany started making a lot of bad missteps. And, the British spiders weave their webs for their victims. And at the same time, you had a similar problem with Bismarck. One of Bismarck's key collaborators in Russia was a fellow by the name of Count Sergei Witte. And Witte as well was somebody who had studied Frederick List. He had translated directly many of Frederick List's writings into Russian. He studied Henry C. Carey, and he was one of the most vigorous proponents of the application of a protective tariff on foreign imports, which is what worked for every nation where it's ever been done to help them stand on their own 2 feet and do battle. He was the biggest driving force behind the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1890. Modeled on the U.S. example of the Transcontinental Railway. It involved the assistance of many American engineers and economists working in Russia, as well as industrialists, like the Baldwin locomotives of Philadelphia were what produced the Russian Trans-Siberian rail cars, and a lot of American know-how, which the Americans had a very close bond, unlike today, with the Russians for a variety of reasons. Russia did help the U.S. In the Civil War. That's largely a deciding factor in what allowed Lincoln to preserve the Union, was the involvement of the Russians, as far as Alexander II had sent the entire, or a big chunk of the Russian Navy as a message to the British and the French to stay out of it. So he had a problem because he's at a certain point, I think it was in 1894, Tsar Alexander III dies. Alexander II had already been killed in 1880, the same, right, I think a few months before Garfield was killed.
Yep.
By a similar process. Anarchist operations run by British intelligence with their American proxies were all over the place. In the United States, there were also, Anglo intelligence operations were deeply embedded with the Russian oligarchy too. That was called the Okhrana. That was the first Russian secret police, set up around the 1878 period. But terrorists, whereas today they have a certain form, always backed by the CIA, MI6 today, but that terrorism took on a different form, more white people back then, ideologically driven anarchists with big utopian ideals for getting rid of property, getting rid of nation states, getting rid of borders, and having this sort of utopian ideal. But to get there, required blowing some things up, killing some troublesome statesmen. And so these useful idiots didn't really know how they were being deployed, but they were always. And so Alexander II had already been killed by a bomb. His son, Alexander III, had more problems, but was still a good guy and was following the advice on almost all points that really matter of Sergei Witte, kept out of the wars with Germany, did a lot to stay out of the wars in Asia too. And the problem was when he died, most likely there's certain forensic analysis that has been done by people like Bill Warwick. He's a medical doctor who's done a lot of work on it. I published a paper that he wrote on this topic, probably poisoning, probably arsenic. Anyway, he died. And Nicholas II, who was his heir, was a much smaller man. He also was troublesome to the oligarchy, but he was much like the Kaiser Wilhelm, who was his cousin, was much more. Both of them came out of. They're both all grandkids of Queen Victoria. You know, she was just spawning like a big spider, just spawning. You know, little babies all over the place and putting them into positions of power. And that's how the system works, right? Just intermarriage and.
So there's the setup for the Russian Revolution. There's perfect setup for the color revolution to follow, pretty much.
It set things up quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, he was led to believe that Sergei Witte was, you know, again, somebody who's taken away your sunshine. He's the star. Everybody respects him. They don't respect you, Nicholas II. And and you know, there was a lot of slander trying to paint Sergei Witte as a Rothschild stooge, you know, because he would take out loans. He was with European banks in order to fund the development of industrial corridors in Russia. And so a lot of this slander really was amplified around the figure of Nicholas II, who they really wanted to break him away from Witte. And at a certain point, Witte was fired. He was the finance minister and transport minister. And I think it was in 1903, he was fired ultimately. And things were going really sour at that time. You know, there was a multifaceted mess built up, and a lot of these young anarchists that had sort of cohered around the writings of Marx as sort of their utopian ideal of what should be done were deployed. People like Parvis, Lenin was an early member, though Lenin, I think, had some virtue later on, but he wasn't as destructive of a force as Parvis, as Jabotinsky, who was an early part of this process. And they created their first Russian Revolution of Chaos in 1905. And this really was a wake-up call for a lot of the Russians who had tried to avoid listening to Witte, and they realized, oh boy, we're much more fragile than when we realized. And Witte was brought back into play for about a year. He was made prime minister, actually, the first to hold that position. And he was like, well, look, you have to, if we're going to save Russia, you have to really push harder on reforms towards freedom. You have to give people, because it was a bit of a dictatorial, censorship-based system, a lot of paranoia. So the people had a lot of gags, they were given a lot of reason to have grievances. So Witte was like, you need economic progress. You got to go full hog on really creating some abundance. And that means education as well. Give people the means of producing for themselves. You got to give more rights to the entrepreneurs. You got to give more rights to people to vote. So the first sort of democratic parliament was set up as well at that time, but it was too little and a little bit too late. So other disturbances were set into motion as well to destabilize the system, and involving as well something that was funded by a lot of London and Wall Street bankers in the form of the attack by Japan onto the Russian Navy. And there were sort of, just like there's two Americas, there were two Japans. And one of the Japans was...
What year was that, Matt?
1904, 1905.
Wow, so isn't that crazy? All this stuff before World War I even sets in motion. I mean, this is nuts.
Oh, these were all needed parts of getting World War I working. Yeah, because you couldn't, back then you couldn't, there was just too much understanding of win-win cooperation to allow World War I to happen. They had to eliminate a lot of the leaders who had the insight to navigate through British traps. So that's where you get the list of assassinations. And then they had to create just a general aura of insanity and chaos. You had to bankrupt Russia through an exhaustive war with Japan. And you did that by getting the Japanese, who had a problem with the new emperor, who was persuaded by some British agents in his court to have an island empire romantic fixation. And he was induced to trust the British because, look, the British were also an island empire, right? One island people who are people of the seas, destined by these cultural, spiritual forces to rule over the inferior people of the earth. And so he really was persuaded to enjoy this toxic idea. And one of the key barriers to that success was the Russian state. And Britain was more than happy to supply some of the highest next generation naval ships, military equipment to the Japanese at the time. The better Japanese were the ones who were trying to follow Lincoln's lead. And this is where there were many of them. The Mitsubishi family was a big pro-Lincoln family in Japan. They were always trying to fight against this imperial sort of samurai ethos. And they were trying to bring in a system of protectionism, development, cooperation. That's why Sun Yat-sen, there more work has to be done, but there's a reason why Sun Yat-sen used Japan as one of his basing operations to plan out the revolution in China, because he had like-minded thinkers who wanted this type of age of brotherhood and cooperation around the world. So you had good and you had bad. One of the things that Jacob Schiff, who was a leading financier, who was awarded with, I think, one of the highest honors a foreigner could get by the Emperor of Japan in 1905. He was awarded because he had poured $20 million in low-interest loans to Japan to build up their war arsenal and effect the war with Russia, which destroyed the entire Russian fleet on the Pacific side. The entire thing was gone in like weeks, done. Russia was left bankrupt. They had to give off a lot of territorial concessions. And again, Witte, that's where Witte was brought back into play when Russia was so humiliated on the international scene, because how could this giant nation get its ass kicked so quickly by the Japanese? And Witte was brought in as a negotiator to broker a peace deal of some sort. And he did a pretty good job. And that's where he became prime minister and got some clout again. But again, his enemies got the better of him. He was ousted once more after maybe, I think, 8 or 9 months. And then you had a wave of assassinations of I think it was something like 6 interior ministers died of Russia, and the problem was Russia started, once Witte was gone, Nicholas II started going in with an iron fist to restore order. And he was not very classy at it. He created a lot of collateral damage of innocent people, which only then fed back into, right, the let's destroy the unjust czar and institute this utopian society of post-property age. So anyway, that was...
Hey, Matt, that money that came from Schiff, that was Wall Street money.
Yep. Yeah, and Schiff was one of the key guys who was integral in affecting the Federal Reserve, the creation of that in 1913.
Yeah, so it's interesting as these machinations are going there. Obviously, they just got rid of McKinley and they're doing it all over in America as well. Do you think it has a lot to do also with the population of America being relatively still, immigrant, ignorant? Not that people couldn't. They knew the elites and called them robber barons, but they were so just trying to survive. They were easy to manipulate. So then what? Roosevelt gets in there. Teddy does his populist kind of like front on the people, and that's what allows them to go with it, you think? Like go along with it?
Well, there's definitely a more it's more naive time, that's for sure. There's a greater tendency to want to believe your whatever leader happens to be there in power. And the US population had they've still been through a lot. There were a lot of people who had living memories of the Civil War, right? It was but they were dying off, they were getting older. So, McKinley was the last presidential veteran of the war. There was no other president that had a living memory of being part of the Civil War. And you know what happens? It's like when you have less to fight, when you fought for less, you have a mushier character. And it's like that. That's the challenge for every generation. Like JFK was a veteran of World War II. His brother died. He risked his life. It builds character.
Right.
There's courage that is incommensurable, that you can't replicate that very easily. So what does that mean? Does that mean you perpetually have to be in a state of constant war to produce strong men and women who have character? No, I hopefully not. But this is where you do need to have like a very strong culture that can really enrich the soul to appreciate and respect the sacrifice of the past, and awaken the desire to make sacrifices for the future. If you don't have that type of cultural momentum, then you get what we've gotten in the past 50 years since JFK died, 60 years, which is just greater and greater mushiness, tendencies of just wanting to live in momentary sensual experience and not thinking about what you've inherited and what you have to give to those unborn, right? You lose that. And when you lose that, you lose your sovereignty of the individual, which means you lose your sovereignty of the society, the community. So back in McKinley's time, yeah, I mean, he had been killed.
Bruce said
go.
like that when in that reading series where he's just like, you just make yourself smaller and smaller and smaller, and then slowly like you just begin to acquiesce to all your rights. And so that's why like an uneducated populace is so easy to control, right? It's for us to get that cultural momentum, people really need to be more educated, and over time more educated people do get to, like you said, consider the more higher ideals and knowledge of like something higher, and that creative force that you always speak about, right? Like that, like I think that that's some parallels where you see where the populace was uneducated, or you see now where more and more people are starting to educate themselves because there's so many people like you and the Cynthias all out there educating folks, and people are really paying attention. Well, I mean, having these conversations is like a part of it, right? But I'm seeing it so much more. So right now, like when I think about like, well, what is the cultural context that needs to exist for more people to really value? Like it's really about what our values are, right? So it just comes down to education. Like, I mean, I'd never heard of Sun Yat-sen ever. Like, why? I went to one of literally the best high schools in the country. And so you're like, well, what, like, why do I know Otto von Bismarck, or why did I study Otto von Bismarck, but I didn't study Sun Yat-sen? Like, and you just realize, like you said, like, I mean, I was literally training to be a globalist, like through my education, like it's real. Like, I realize that now. I'm like, if I hadn't been out here on the fringe where I am right now, I literally would like be working for the UN or one of those, like, type of things. So just, I'm really just seeing how the cultural shift comes from the education and the cooperation of the people, like really wanting to be involved. Most people now are just like, whatever, I don't want to know, or I don't want to be involved. I'll just stay here in my little hut.
Absolutely. And I would not know about Sun Yat-sen as well. I mean, it's most people wouldn't. And it's like, you have to really search it out. Like that hunger has to be there, because there's a lot of work that's gone into giving us a particular framing of everything that is only beneficial to a certain type of wannabe priest class that wants to rule over a bunch of slaves stuck in a cave believing in shadows. But then it's like, when you start getting the taste, you can't put it back. It takes, a fire. It's very easy to kindle that fire. Because as soon as people get a taste of a little discovery, they're like, they want more. That's like, you start seeing that there's this spiritual food you've been missing. And that's really what we're designed for, is these discoveries, right?
Yeah,
but then you want to share them. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's part of what makes this work.
Yes.
Hey, Matt, when you go off like that, that's music to our ears, just so you know, man. We love that. It really is, because you have a nice natural way of blending a certain soulful spiritual energy, but being very real about it. You're a realist. It just flows with you. Your knowledge and your soulfulness flow really nice together, man. It's
well, awesome. You know what's so nice? Thank you very much for those. That's really nice of you. But I think one thing that really awakens that is reading Sun Yat-sen. Like when you read the writings of a lot of these people, I have some lectures of Sergei Witte, and we're reading. You're reading with our group here.
We're catching up.
It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, but we're just reading these people, and you're like, they've all been through the fire. They've all found this poetic beauty in being human and training their minds to see the potential more than the actual, right? So people might in their actual momentary expression be kind of disappointing. But when you're like looking with your mind's eye, you're always looking at the potential as being more real than the physical, because the potential is that's everything, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The physical is always the past, right? Like even now, the second I say something, it's already in the past.
Damn.
You're always trying to catch it. It's always disappearing, but the future is underdefined. It's the product of our choices, our creative decisions, our ideas. And so they all do that in varying degrees. Yeah. And it gives them also in many ways a certain playfulness too, which is really nice. Like when you read Benjamin Franklin, the guy's a joke maker. And Randy, you sent me this list of
limericks. That's why I thought you would enjoy it, because of that one you said.
Yeah, Cynthia and I are looking forward to looking at it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, you got to feed off of people who take themselves too seriously are not very effective in the real world history of politics. You don't see anybody like Saint Augustine is cracking jokes in the middle of his City of God. He's cracking jokes in his Confessions. Nice. Thomas More, even Cicero, like they've all got Plato. The guy's a jokester. He's ironic. And that's why people who are literalists, they try to read Plato and they come out with these conclusions like, oh, he's so undecided. He never just or they'll say like, oh, he's a fascist, because he has these. He wants to have a totalitarian system and throw babies off the cliff. We're born into golden families, but they have bronze souls. And it's like, no, he's testing you. These are mental exercises you have to think about, because his whole point was, if we assume that breeding leaders is like breeding dogs, guard dogs, this is what follows.
Yeah.
Okay, well, is that anything like breeding guard dogs? No. He was trying to catch you to see if you can examine your own assumptions. And if you don't, and you leave something unexamined and you start building an edifice, it's on sand, and you'll result in, you might have good intentions, but you'll come up with conclusions that make you a fascist.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many people out there right now that it's so many similarities like that. There's all these like not examining your own beliefs, but then but they build anyway, regardless of whether you're examining them or not. You have beliefs, right? So it's like, unless you're doing that examination and like creating your own, then you're just gonna do whatever you're gonna become whatever you're being fed.
Yeah, exactly. You are what you eat. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like, we're either going to be our own cooks and choose what we eat, or if we're not examining our assumptions, like you said, the assumptions will still be there. We might not know what they are, but they'll be put there and controlled not by us. Somebody else is going to be feeding us, and it won't be good food. And so again, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a bad person. You might be a very nice person. It means you might even do some good things if you have political power. But it also means that you're going to make easy missteps and you won't have consistent judgment, which is where you get a lot of, there's very few cases of truly bad people and truly consistently good people. Anywhere in history, you tend to find most people kind of floating in and out of it, sometimes doing good things, like Thomas Jefferson, right? No one could say that he did bad things all the time. He was vital at certain key moments in history, and he did good. He was willing to die for a cause of freedom. Now, did he believe that he should protect the institution of slavery and have sex with his slaves and not let his slaves go free even after he died? Yeah, he believed all of those things, and he did those things. Yeah, it's terrible. Does that mean everything he did is bad? No, but he didn't know himself. He loved John Locke. He didn't understand Franklin. He didn't like Ben Franklin. He liked Adam Smith. He didn't like Hamilton. Why did Hamilton fight to get him into the presidency?
And why do we define these historical figures in a different way than we would examine ourselves, right? As humans, souls in the physical, right? Like, we make mistakes. Like, who can say that they haven't done things that maybe go against their values at times? But then when we're looking at these historical figures, it's like, oh my gosh, they have to be perfect. They have to only be this one way. That's not even human nature.
No, exactly. It's this, I think it's just Hollywood conditioning that just simplifies humanity.
We've made up
fucking Hollywood.
Yeah. But no, I mean, for sure, like you're dealing now. So with the question of how positive changes are made in political life you have to, I think one of the themes is you have to be flexible. You have to not, wisdom is sometimes learning to say the right things, but it's more often than not, as you see with people like Witte or Bismarck or many others, it's learning when not to say things. Wisdom is sometimes withholding or speaking laterally, because either you don't want to show your cards,
Right.
because things you might want to do are going to be easily destroyed, or, you might not, the people you might want to communicate or you might need to communicate with don't have the internal psychospiritual infrastructure to handle direct statements of truth directly. And so sometimes you have to speak with a lateral or metaphorical fashion, or, provide something that will allow people to be the best that they could be without necessarily. It's like Ben Franklin, he made a great point in his autobiography, directed to his son, who ends up getting sucked into the Hellfire Club. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, but he tried to keep his son back in the light. But he's like, look, what was it? The Quakers would not fight the revolution. It was against their religious ideology. But it's like, I couldn't go and just tell them that you're stupid and that, you're going to put everybody at risk if you just stay a pacifist on this point. But what I was able to do is I created fire departments, and they had no problem being fire departments. So I got them to participate in the fight indirectly by putting out fires. And, so all that to say, you have a lot of people within oligarchical systems who are mixed bags, but have big egos, as the Kaiser did, as a lot of the warlords of China did, as the Tsar did, and many others. But you have to be able to still figure out how do you get the best out of that as much as you possibly can, until we can become a society which doesn't have.
One of the things that I remember in that same period was obviously you go extensively into Gilpin, but I love the idea not only of the Trans-Siberian Railway that they had planned, which is yet to be fully, completed, but that idea of taking water from Alaska and the BC. I mean, we're living right down, obviously I've traveled all around the Southwest, and it's, it's a desert. Right now we're in a desert by the ocean, basically, in terms of the amount of rainfall we get. Mm-hmm. And that idea of through canals and dams and whatever was necessary to convert, and they're talking rainwater at the time, if I'm correct, like 20 to 30% of the water that's just going to go to the ocean anyhow, and bringing it all the way down. Basically, it would replenish one way. It showed all the way to the Great Lakes, and then all the way down into the Southwest. Yeah, and it's still on the table. If I looked it up recent, it's still on the table.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about continental water management and rail development.
Right. They were simultaneous.
They co-evolved together. Yeah. Right. And yeah, indeed, when you go back into the 1890s, there were many of the leading American system economists who were looking at the impending problem, or not the impending, but the real problem, even a century ago, of the droughts, the deserts of the West Coast, and the superabundance of water in the north, in the Yukon, in Alaska, in British Columbia. I mean, it's just disproportionately massive, but not a lot in Arizona, obviously California, Texas. So how do you have a continental planning of water management properly done? Because we ended up, and this takes us, this is more in the mid 20th century that this started getting off the ground, or maybe 1930s, you had a lot of dam building begin in earnest. But earlier, it should have happened much sooner. So JFK built a lot of dams in the 60s. There were more dams being built a little bit, but it tapered off in the 70s, and it stopped. It just stopped completely, like 50 years ago. We stopped building dams. It should have begun in the 1890s. That's when there was a big momentum. We started building little dams, but what happened was, and you alluded to Teddy Roosevelt. So when McKinley died, McKinley was a continental and pan-continental planner. He was already talking about, advancing the Panama Canal, but not just that, but building rail across the Panama Canal to connect and industrialize Ibero-America.
I know.
He was really moving ahead, and that's actually where he was assassinated, was the Pan American Conference in 1901. By somebody affiliated with British intelligence, through a person named Emma Goldman, who was part of the British Neo-Malthusian League. she was actually taken out. She was given bail, or her bail was paid for by Bertrand Russell, and she was brought to London after the
No way.
yeah.
What a club.
Yeah, very tight knit group.
Very tight knit.
Prince Kropotkin, who is a high level Russian oligarch as well, who was very enmeshed in what's called the Holy Brotherhood. It's a secret society for the sort of feudal nobility of Russia that had managed the Okhrana, the secret police that was behind the creation of these terrorist networks, these cells and cells within cells of anarchists that were then deployed to destroy the Tsar later on, and many others. They were all that. He was also part of the Goldman circles.
Right.
So all that to say, McKinley was really pushing forward for a system of win-win cooperation, both for the Americas, but also, he was working very closely to help with American funds and technology in China with the building of things like rail and economic development. You had a 100 days reform attempt in 1897 in China, which was one attempt from within the Qing dynasty government to really do what Sergei Witte was trying to get the Tsar to do in 1905, which was integrate the people into the government, create economic reforms that would allow for the release of the tension. Because when you have a lot of poverty and you have a lot of corrupt nobles, you got that tension that Marx talks about. That's a pressure cooker that can easily be triggered. So you want to get rid of that in a lawful way. You don't want to give people fake handouts. You don't want to give them, but you want to do it in a way which is qualitative, which is what they were trying to do in the 1890s. And McKinley was a big part of that discussion as well. Witte, like I said, was trying to do that in Russia. That didn't work out. But it could have. It really easily could have. But so McKinley was a macro thinker. But when he died, and we talked about this, I remember the last chat we had, was Teddy Roosevelt, who was positioned to become his vice president, became president. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is the guy who was behind the Philippine War. He is the guy who was he romanticized the Confederacy, even though his mom, who he adored, was this heiress to a Confederate slave holding. It was giant. And she always gave him these romantic stories of how great life was when you had 1,000 slaves and we were drinking our mint juleps and life was good. And
with the whip in the hand.
Yeah, in the civilized whip, the civilizing whip.
We've definitely seen our share of it.
Yeah. So he was really into that. He romanticized the genteel lifestyle of the South. He romanticized the British. His uncle, Bullock,
that up about his uncle,
was the head of the Confederate intelligence services of Europe throughout the entire Civil War, and he lived out his days in Britain, along with many other Confederate leading figures. So he was a grand strategist who wanted to try to create an Anglo-American type of relationship, which never existed. There was no trust or no love for the British by the Americans for the first 130 years of its existence. They rightfully distrusted the British. Teddy was, I think, the most ardent, open fan of the British, and he had his uncle's books on sea power provided to all of the members of the Congress and the Senate. And he also was a big fan of this guy, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an enemy of Gilpin in many ways, an intellectual enemy at least.
Yeah, you just wrote an excellent essay on that. That was brilliant.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Yeah. Mahan was, where Gilpin was trying to advance the idea of land power, that America should develop itself according to its inner potentials, driven by rail and industry that would then connect through the Bering Strait into Alaska, into China, into Russia. That's what the Gilpin view of things was. That was the Lincoln orientation. That was the Sun Yat-sen orientation. And then Alfred Thayer Mahan had the opposing view that no, Britain managed to dominate the world for 150, 160 years by the seas. And he put forth a whole bunch of crappy books trying to justify the idea that building rail is a waste of money and time. It's so much better if we just do like the British everything the British do. We should have more colonies. And he was a major Darwinian racist who believed that, that the white Anglo-Saxons were destined to rule the world. And as the Übermenschen, over the Untermenschen darker skinned people. And that was like, he really is into that. And that's why Teddy Roosevelt loved him, because Teddy Roosevelt was also a eugenics loving racist. He gave the first major federal government support for eugenics and sterilization bills, like in 1907 in Indiana, but it was even going on before that. He was also a big conservationist. He was the one who took the British example.
Took all the land.
Yeah, that's how the British were able to keep India subjugated, because India it's not like they didn't have a lot of ideas for building dams and creating industries and rail in India in the 1860s and 70s. There was a big discussion of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But the way the British responded to that was they said, no, we're going to have these game parks and protective zones that will be there to preserve the fauna and flora. And if you build a dam, it's going to disturb the fauna and flora. And so you're not allowed. And so you have these terrible cases where India is producing more food than it even needs for its people, but they're starving in the millions because British free trade demands that excess food product be exported to the foreign markets. So that was part of the Malthusian population control, the science of population control, the dismal science. But conservation parks was the key. Create conservation, these no development zones, right? And romanticize this pristineness of nature that is untouched by human beings and perfect just the way it is. Even if it's a desert, it's only good if it's a desert, because if you green it, you change it, and thus you hurt it. You hurt the desert, because those cactuses won't exist anymore. So,
see, does everybody hear this? This is over 100 years ago, and this is the green movement today talking this same nonsense.
Oh yeah, this is the origins of the American movement. This is what Teddy Roosevelt brought in with all of the reservations and protective regions of the West Coast of the United States, which is just everything, right? Federal lands that cannot be developed, and thus all of the ideas for continental water management, all of a sudden you cut their legs off. You can't go forward.
Yeah.
And he was a big romantic, he's a big follower of John Muir, a transcendentalist, somebody, of a Thoreau, type of orientation, who just, again, ultimately behind the nice words of the mystic beauty of nature, there's a deep-seated misanthropy, this belief that human beings are ultimately these pollution-making, disgusting things. There's too many of them. And you get in the transcendentalist circles, a lot of this underlying anti-humanism, even though there's a lot of pretty words and it's attractive, and I understand that. But John Muir was a big one, who was a bit of a guru for Teddy as well. So all this stuff sort of came together like a you know John Muir?
I didn't know that. That kind of bummed me out, but whatever.
Yeah.
I wanted to like him. I like the John Muir trails.
Oh, the beautiful trails. But there's
Oh no, but I think it's more about what you're saying. It's like it's part of the way they put veneers up, right?
Yeah.
And how they hide behind veneers, how they hide behind what appears to be like, well, hey, we're all gonna work together and make the world a better place, when behind the scenes they're doing the 180 opposite. That's what just gets
well, that's the thing, right?
Or by not doing anything. Like, it's better to
Yeah.
do nothing and just leave it and preserve it than to actually like do the things that might allow
Improve
people
upon
to
it.
improve upon it and prosper. And like it's such a weird hook.
Exactly.
Got like so many liberals, right? Like, conserve this, keep this the same, keep it the same, keep it the same. It's like, no, what are we like? What is progress? Like, it's not keeping everything the same. It's respecting nature and working with the laws of nature, and then using technology to improve society for everybody.
Well, that's the thing where I think you get like this false dichotomy between the left and the right these days, where a lot of the monetarist right-wing libertarian types will tend to often say, like, I wouldn't say, let me not bash libertarians for now. Let me just make a point. Just for a lot of those monetarists who tend to be of the right-wing conservative bent, who tend to not really, they don't believe in the garbage pseudoscience of man-made global warming, which is not anybody listening right now. If you're confused by that, human activity is not causing global warming. It's not happening. I'll just say it.
Yeah, say it.
And,
Right.
and let's remember the trees and the plants, they love carbon dioxide.
carbon
Yeah,
dioxide.
carbon dioxide.
It's
It's food for
them.
plants. They love it. Now, the problem is a lot of these conservatives will say everything we do is fine. We could clear cut a rainforest, whatever. We are the stewards of nature. Nature is there completely to serve us, right? Get this sort of bad manifest destiny, bad Pax Americana type of thinking behind that everything exists just for humans. So it becomes to a point where you take humans at the expense of everything else. And then the other side has reacted to a lot of the destruction that was done of indiscriminate polluting and destruction of nature. And then they're like, well, no, just don't touch anything. Stop it. And you get like this other anal approach of neurotically being afraid of making any changes in nature. And it's like you said, Brandy, if you just take the time to understand what these laws of nature are before you act, it's okay. Then act, but act with wisdom and be prepared to learn from your mistakes, because you're going to make mistakes, but don't keep doing the bad thing. Like, learn from it and do something that is now better, you know? And if you have that self-reflectiveness going into greening a desert, terraforming something, you know, building a dam, you'll always be able to work with nature more. It'll be a dance. You won't be forcing nature into doing something it doesn't want to do. And nature wants to develop, right? Like, that's why, you know, when you look at, that's why I love Vernadsky, but when you look at the behavior of living matter from 500 million years ago, from the Cambrian period, where there was just simple celled organisms, which were relatively kind of boring, to the intermediate, like every step of the way, there is this yearning of life to not just be more of itself, but to become better as well, to create new biotechnologies like chlorophyll and other things that allow life to thrive and to blossom and to diversify and to have a division of labor, that each part has a role to play in a whole. And that's to the point that we've got us here, like, just communicating over this.
I know,
right?
Like,
With like light, carrying information and sound. It's just wild. This is as if that was all just random mutations. We just got lucky that happened. It's like, no. So work with nature, right? Nature wants to get better. It wants to grow. We should want to help it along, have more CO2 to feed it, have more sunlight. Don't be like Bill Gates. Don't block out the sunlight, you know, give it more sunlight, give it more water, desalinate water. You know, we have easy ways of creating easy desalination through a variety of techniques, and take some of that ocean water, bring it in, and bam, you got a very happy, you know, nature that will like you and want more, you know, want to help you, and you'll have more people too.
Yeah. Every time we do this drive up north, we go up the 101 and then we take the 46 out of Paso Robles and go into the inland valley. And I just see how easy it would be to have your pumping stations, and the desal plant is set up somewhere over there. And you're just bringing the water into for the farmers. It's so simple. And
it can't work. It can't work if you make it. Oh yeah, go on.
Well, they've actually, my understanding is they had a plan for 8 desal plants from San Diego all the way, I don't know how far up, but it was in the works. It's not even like they don't know. It's like, what's really behind it? It's the same kind of energies and forces that don't want this kind of peace, progress, and prosperity. And then they sell you a kind of basically a bogus agenda and get people kind of like, in a lot of ways, I think people, they want to do the right thing and even learn it the right way, but they're just not getting the opportunity unless you have the courage to go outside the narratives. And I think that's like, even in California, there's a lot of good solution oriented people out here, but the politics and the globalist agendas are very entrenched. And, you know, it could come around. I see a vision for California. It could be the first organic state where everything's organic. You could knock Monsanto out of here. Wouldn't that be a goal for California, since we grow so much food? You know, you couldn't keep the Monsanto products out of the Walmarts, but you could definitely pass a law that could keep it from contaminating all your crops and your livestock and what have you. I mean, it's just maybe 100 years down the road, or it could be 30 years down the road, you know, or 3 years with the right leadership, right? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, definitely having a problem solving orientation is key, because there's problems, and, you know, rather than getting caught in the, I mean, obviously we have to work out the mechanics, but a lot of people will get immediately stuck in the weeds and they just give up on actually trying to solve the problem. And they end up getting sucked into all of these side smaller issues that don't go anywhere. It just absorbs their energy and time, and ultimately nothing happens. The problems get worse. And it's like that too, where, you know, people are debating about, you know, like different regions of California are fighting over who's going to get the scarce limited supplies of water, and aquifers are disappearing. And you got like little cities and communities fighting with each other, and counties fighting with counties. And it's like, there's no ultimate solution if people stick within the framework. Like, obviously you need to have these discussions because the water has been drained down and we didn't plan ahead. So now we got this problem. But at the same measure, the solution is not there. You have to take a step back, look at, well, where's the water? Okay, the fact is the water is still in Alaska and the Yukon. That's in northern BC. That's where all the water of the continent is. It flows, it rains down on there, but there's not a lot of vegetation or wildlife. It's a lot of tundra. And that water doesn't participate in supporting biomass. It goes straight out through streams back into the ocean, and it goes back up into vapor clouds. It ends up having its own cycle, never participating in supporting living matter at all. And so that's kind of it is a waste of water. That is water that is being literally wasted. So the way that would be able to participate in supporting life and moving through living systems, and that includes human systems, would be to start building a few reservoirs, some collection zones, as has been discussed and has been planned out by the Parsons Company, by people like Bobby Kennedy was even supporting this and advocating this. Senator Frank Moss was a big voice in the 60s. People like W.A.C. Bennett, the premier of British Columbia from 1953 to 73, was a big proponent of this. And then, you know, once you have a few select dams built that would then create reservoirs that would take some time to fill up, just like what they're doing in Ethiopia right now, or what they're doing in China by the big Move South Water North China project that's going to be finished. The biggest water project in history. It's going to green big chunks of the Gobi Desert. They've already finished phase 1 and phase 2 already. It's done. You know, at that point, you got the pressure, the gravitational pressure, that gravity will do most of the work. It will just simply move down in the existing river systems, the existing, there's so much that's already there that would then bring that water through, again, a few lifts. There would be probably about 20 or 30 lifts along the way, that would have a lot of hydropower stations that would create an abundance of electricity. You could probably build something like 80 hydroelectric dams easily on this entire circuit, all the way down from the north to Texas, even probably down into Mexico. Definitely down to Mexico. And along the way, you are going to replenish aquifers that we're told cannot be replenished, will be replenished. You could even do this more quickly by having some side, as you mentioned, there's a variety of desalination projects that could be done easily as well, just to like bring in more ocean water into some of the reservoirs. You'd be saving farmland out of the wazoo. You would be creating so much abundant, rich farmland, you couldn't even know what to do with it. We could feed the world several times over. Easy. And it would take probably, in the estimates that were done by the Parsons Company back in 1964, it would take about 25 to 30 years at a certain budgetary constraint. But if you did like the full-blown JFK maximum NASA budget, as far as like a 4% of GDP, which is what NASA was at its max, you could accelerate that to about 12 to 14 years if you were to go full hog. It's doable.
We got to get our priorities back in line, man. That was really well said, man. Thank you for doing that. I've been wanting to get that out of you for a while, because that's just a fascinating project to me, living out here. Because I came from Michigan, where there's tons of rain. You know, it's just different.
Yeah, we
North American water and power lines.
Yes.
I was listening. I think it was on Del Bigtree show. He did a clip with Leslyn Lewis. Are you familiar? She's looks like she might be a Black woman, but she's based in Canada. And she was talking. She's running for some sort of position, and she was like blowing the lid off of the whole Green New Deal and just like talking to people and saying like, look, this is the reality of it. Like, because she was talking about the electric cars and the lithium batteries and all the problems that are associated with that. And it's like, we need people like her to like really be in on ideas like this that are easily accessible or that are already on the table and available. I mean, obviously it takes more cooperation, but it's like more people need to understand that it could be done, obviously with a lot of money, in 12 to 13 years, but even 30 years, like it's available to us. And how do we get that into the right leadership, like that information?
Yeah, absolutely. She's not bad. She's running for the Conservative Party head. So there's a big race right now, and I think the vote's going to happen very soon. I like her. Everything I've seen so far has been pretty good.
I've only seen that one clip, but it seems like at least she's more educated than a lot of people I've seen out there.
Yeah, we definitely need a lot more people like her, for sure. And yeah, I think it's just getting people out of the electric fence of the mind, you know, that just
yeah,
that's the key.
Yeah, that's it.
And we don't even, people just have their assumptions prevent their minds from going certain places that they're not allowed to go according to their assumptions. But it's like, if you just let go of some unexamined assumptions that were put there in your head by a crappy education system that told you that human beings are a parasite, or that everything we do is disruptive to nature's equilibrium. And so your mind would be able to start moving in vistas that you hadn't even imagined. And it gets exciting because you're like, oh, we can actually solve these problems. I mean, and a lot of problems that you thought were problems are actually not problems.
Yeah.
You know, there are real problems, but the ones that people are stressed about, whether it's pandemics or whether it's human-made, CO2, those are not actually things to stress about. Don't worry about it. You know, whole industries have been created around like green psychologists trying to help young people going into anxiety attacks because they've been told, you know, they're a cancer on the earth, destroying nature, and we'll all be dead underwater in a burning furnace in like, you know, whatever, 2050, according to Greta Thunberg, maybe sooner, they think. That's a lot of anxiety and stress for young people. So they have counselors and people making a living off of just, you know, working people through just getting by.
Get all these social behaviorist counselor types, right? And the kids are going in to try to get some therapy, and they're just going to come out worse. So I mean,
or another gender, you know, whatever. Like,
oh yeah, you know it.
Maybe that's really what you need to feel better.
Oh,
you know, maybe just cut off your anyway.
Oh, she sent me something the other day. I couldn't even watch after 15 minutes. I was just like, man, I can't stomach it, Brent.
What is what Matt Walsh's?
I saw that.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah. Cynthia and I watched that. That was good.
Yeah,
I couldn't get through it, so maybe I'll have to give it another chance.
I like his approach. I mean, he just stuck to it, and man, nobody would answer the question. What is
deadpan, just deadpan, consistent. I just want to know.
I just want to know. I mean, I'm at the Women's March. Like, I mean, does anybody know what a woman is?
He never says anything antagonistic or rude. He's just,
he really just.
Oh no, he's
quiet. Just tell me what it is.
Please, I just really.
I love that. At one point, he's like to the professor at I forget which Ivory Tower or Ivy League University, the social scientist, and he's like, finally, after getting this guy to just talk and not answer any question, he's just like, well, could you just answer what is a woman without using the word woman?
Right.
Ultimately, all of the guy's answers refer to, well, it's if whoever feels like a woman. But what is a woman? What is this thing you feel like? Just say it.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. But yeah, he couldn't even get through it. He was just like, in the beginning.
It just caught me on a bad day. You know, I had my moods, man. It was one of them days. I don't know.
No, you got to be in a specific mindset.
Yeah. I was not
it is enraging. And one thing clinically interesting, or philosophically, is that the reason why these people can't answer it is because it's Plato. They actually don't know Plato, because Plato, the whole point of the Platonic method, which is what Matt Walsh is kind of using, whether he knows it or not, is just simply admitting that you don't know things, right? Just admit it, be humble,
right?
Don't take anything for granted. Make sure that your assumptions are as defined as they could possibly be before you start building on them. Right. And look for what is the purpose to things. Not what do you name something or how do you describe something. No. Don't do that, because there's infinite descriptions for everything. Go for what does it do and why, right? Why is this? Why is there a woman? Because it's only when you get at that you start, okay, well, women do things that men don't do. Oh, what are those things, and why is that? What it brings you into what is the broader process that woman is a part of? Why are we designed, right? Why is oxygen there on the periodic table where it's located? Why is silicon where it's located? Why does life resonate to specific, 7 specific elements on the periodic table and not other elements that it doesn't resonate to? Why? Right. And when you do that, you start getting a much more fruitful pathway into solution concepts that you would not get if you were just spending all of your time just trying to quantify and label and name things like an Aristotelian. It becomes masturbatory and it doesn't get you anywhere.
Right.
So that's what Matt Walsh does. It's such a simple thing. Like, he's essentially saying, well, why are women? And nobody can answer that because they've all been given an Aristotelian, conditioning in school.
Yeah.
Why is an economy? To make you happy. What is happiness? Well, there you go. Like, what is progress? To ask what is happiness is to get it to the question of potential, right? Like, why are we? We are. It's to make ourselves better, make the universe better. We were created within a creative universe to be a part of that unfolding of creation, which is always getting better. To the degree that we're making things worse for ourselves and the universe, it means that or at least, I don't know if we can make the universe worse, but to the degree that we're making things worse, is to the degree to which we're falling out of alignment with nature, with natural law and the universe's will for us. So it's not that, and that's economics. That's why is there government? And Putin actually said something really beautiful. I just got to read this because, on this question of sovereignty, I published a speech by Putin on the Canadian Patriot website, and I've not seen such a good definition of sovereignty. But this is a perfect example, okay, of what I'm talking about. And I'm just pulling it up as we speak here, because most people define sovereignty. The Aristotelian way is to basically say, well, sovereign. There we go. It's usually to say, well, it's the right to be left alone. It's the right to just make your own decisions, to do what you want to do, right? Something kind of like lame like that. And those might be kind of like elements of it, but it's not it. And in Putin's speech in the Strong Ideas for a New Time Forum, he said sovereignty is about freedom of national development. So not just freedom of national development, and thus the development of every individual. So he connects the individual change in a positive way, as well as the nation's need to change in a positive way. So it's connected. So that's creative right there. It's not just staying with what exists. It's about moving in a way which is new. It is about the technological, cultural, intellectual, and educational solvency of a state. That is what it is. And so, I mean, that's just so clear.
It is.
It's like, why is sovereignty?
I like that quote.
And people like Sun Yat-sen understood that. When you read like Sun Yat-sen's Principles of National Development, or the International Development of China, which is one of his last books in 1920, he lays out all of the different potential development strategies for China, with integrated rail connecting East and West. Basically, the entire Belt and Road Initiative is outlined in 1920 in his studies in that book. And there's beautiful maps he's done in all of the different domains for mining, ports. He charts out the hydroelectric dam that was later, it became the Yangtze Three Gorges Dam, one of the biggest dams of the world. That he's already charting that out back in 1920. And he's thinking in these terms.
So basically the Chinese, they picked up where he left off eventually, you might say. It took a while, but they did.
Yeah, I mean, it was really when when Mao died, and Mao was sort of a mixed bag, sometimes doing some useful things, sometimes being persuaded, he's kind of like an emperor character, kind of like a Wilhelm, or you could think of him, I think of him kind of like a Nicholas II or a Wilhelm kind of character who has a giant ego.
Who's the guy that took over in 29 that was the nationalist that followed in Sun Yat-sen's footsteps? And I think
that's Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek, as far as I could see, was a disaster. He was somebody.
Like, why did
he was corrupt as all hell. He was working with the warlords to the wazoo. He was doing a lot of backdoor dealing and compromising on some serious principles.
And then he was in power for how long?
Not very long. You know,
Now, then that can't be the one.
From the 30s up until throughout the 30s, he was the one who the United States was primarily wanting to deal with, because the communists at the time were still too messed up. Kind of like in Russia too, the Bolsheviks were, it was difficult to deal with the Bolsheviks because it was such a mixed bag. There were some good people, a lot of whack jobs. They came out of a process of chaos. Nobody really kind of knew, you know, you had Trotsky, who was a leading figure, the worst of the worst, who was a major power player in Russia in the 1920s. But you also had good people in Russia too, who came out of that process, took power, and who were fighting against Trotsky, which is why Trotsky ended up getting kicked out of Russia and banned for life. But he had a whole network of Fabian Society styled fifth columnists who were loyal to his ideology, who remained embedded in every echelon of government, education, military, civil society, everything, or the civil service. And that's what was behind the Moscow trials in the 1930s, was the fact that there was this very real fifth column deep state, which tried to and did kill some leading figures around Stalin, and tried several times to oust and kill Stalin. And their plots were discovered, and a lot of them, you know, got executed. And so we've been told by the roundtable CFR style propaganda machine that Stalin made it all up. There was never actually a Trotskyite conspiracy. It's like, no. Grover Furr is a historian who did some remarkable work. I bought all of his books. It took me a while to actually come to terms with this fact, but he proves it. There really was a hardcore conspiracy, and Trotsky was working with the worst fascists of Britain, Japan, and Hitler. So he had networks all the way deeply embedded throughout the entire, you know, transhumanist intelligentsia that was working to create a global new world order fascist government. He was supposed to be the guy who was going to kill Stalin, take power, join up with Hitler, and have this globalist alliance back in the 1930s.
See, that's that's hardcore, man. I heard G. Edward Griffin say how those roundtable groups and the CFR, he said, you know, it was like these groups of people, but they were more than just influential. They were strategists. And they got together to just try to figure out how could you infiltrate every sector of society necessary to basically take over the world. And exactly what you just said were those kind of machinations that we keep unraveling more and more. It's going to make a difference in the long run as we continue, you know, to put this out there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's so important to just like appreciate the good that they're trying to subvert. You know, like there's a real natural goodness that human beings are tuning themselves to. And it's the sort of the same thing that Sun Yat-sen also saw a lot of virtue in the good people who were congealing around the communist movement in the 1920s. Now, he was originally trying to organize a trust, like a coalition between the Kuomintang and the communists based upon mutual development, mutual trust. And like, look, his own wife, Madame Sun Yat-sen, ended up becoming a leading figure within the communist movement after he dies. Wow. Now, the reason, if he had lived with his wisdom and, you know, sagehood, he would have, I'm sure, made it work. The problem was you had British agents within the Communist Party. You had the Yale Skull and Bones networks embedded early on within the intelligentsia of the Communist Party. You had also you know, British networks that had been loyal to the British Freemasonic networks and triads within the warlord systems that the Kuomintang was working with. And Chiang Kai-shek did not have that flexibility. He took himself very seriously. He could not tell a joke the way Sun Yat-sen could. And he was, his rigidity, I think, got the best of him. And he saw himself as sort of he modeled himself as a fascist. He saw himself modeled on Franco, or Mussolini, you know, the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. Whereas I think, you know, a lot of the better people who were attracted to communism were people who had a heart. You know, they were like, okay, I've seen a lot of the destruction and evil done by empire in the name of capitalism, which, you know, the capitalist powers had largely been taken over by imperial forces that many people didn't understand like today. And so they ended up becoming, some of the best people that you found were people who really loved human beings. They loved social justice and things. They hated empire, and they ended up becoming communists during that period. But again, you had the communists who were using communism just as a veneer to attract useful idiots in order to impose a scientific dictatorship. That's like the Fabian Society. And then you had people like Paul Robeson, who is, very much saw himself as a socialist, as a, he admired and worked with many, W.E.B. Du Bois as well. Another, these were people who generally loved humanity and were willing to die for the cause of humanity, and did a lot of good. And they were in China. People like Zhou Enlai was a major figure who worked very closely with Mao. But Zhou Enlai was sort of the sane factor, whereas the Gang of Four were the courtiers whispering in Mao's ear, flattering him and inflaming his godlike ego, making him do things that were stupid and destructive. And, you had like Zhou Enlai working on the other side, who was like, Zhou Enlai was one of these great figures who was very close to Madame Sun Yat-sen, who was close to many of the best people of the West, was working with people like Jawaharlal Nehru in organizing like the Bandung Conference, where in 1954, the five principles of coexistence were created, along with and essentially this is what the non-aligned movement grew out of.
That was cool.
So you had people like that who were real lovers and understood the need for industrial progress to emancipate people and to bring people into a position where they could become citizens. And he was fighting that whole time. So as soon as Mao dies, the Gang of Four, who were always behind the Cultural Revolution, which was a self-mutilation for China, it was like taking your specialists, people who had real world skills, and then basically forcing them to be reconditioned in a farm, because the idea was, the uneducated farmer is the only pure figure of society. Everybody the more you have knowledge, the more you're impure, was the underlying cult. And a lot of this came out of the work of a British agent who actually was a key figure in demonizing Stalin, named John Dewey. Now, John Dewey is an education reformer who's behind a lot of the big education reforms in the West. He worked closely with Bertrand Russell in
I was like,
together. And Dewey's philosophy of education is theory is corruption, doing is learning. So you just get people to do things, and then they will have knowledge. The more you get them into metaphysics and broader theories, the more they fall out of whack with reality. Bertrand Russell was all about theory and no practicality. So Bertrand Russell was sent down to China, where he gave classes. He basically was a teacher of Mao when Mao was young, as an editor for one of these Chinese Princeton magazines, and he created and indoctrinated what became the sociopathic intelligentsia of China, like the worst elements of the ivory tower technocrats, who only had theory, but they didn't want to dirty themselves with real world skills. That's what he created. And then Dewey created the opposing polarity that was then designed to target the masses, so that the masses would then have an over arrogance, thinking that they're then the best, noble savages, because they weren't contaminated with higher education. And so that whole cultural revolution was very much imbued with that Deweyite type of philosophy, mixed with still an elite Bertrand Russellian elitism, because who's ultimately controlling, who's going to be sent down to become a laborer for the rest of your life, and who's going to be allowed to maintain a position of management, still elitist. Even though you want to try to pretend it's not, it is. Which is why people like Henry Kissinger loved China at that time, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau were going down to China in 1971, 72, because they wanted that to be the role model for the entire Great Reset world, right? It was like a perfect cultural Great Reset. And when Mao dies, the Gang of Four loses their protection, and then you get a very interesting fight, because when immediately there's a power struggle, and Zhou Enlai's faction, Zhou Enlai had also just died that same period, but his faction, his collaborators, carry out a massive backdoor fight and end up arresting the Gang of Four. And the Gang of Four are put in prison for decades. And now you have Deng Xiaoping, who's brought in, much more pragmatic, but he's a student of Zhou Enlai. And Deng Xiaoping actually he's thinking on a much longer wave of history. And so he's thinking, okay, we have to go from like backward, 3%, whatever it is, higher educate, like 3% of the Chinese population at that point in 1975 had access to anything, any higher education. The illiteracy rates were astounding. There was not a lot in the way of technological development, obviously. A lot of poverty. So how do you leapfrog? How do you do what the West did in 300 years within the period of a couple of generations? That's how he was thinking. And so he systematically worked towards building a foundation. Now, the problem was, again, there were a lot of foreign operatives embedded within the Communist Party throughout the 70s, 80s, especially. Still is today, but there are a lot, the garden has been weeded a lot more, let's just say. But there were people like Soros's stooge, Zhao Ziyang, became premier of China. He brought in the Club of Rome in 1979 into China, along with Song Jian, who was a leading cyberneticist who had been trained in Russia in the 1950s. And cybernetics, after Stalin dies, takes over Russia. So that's the thing. Like, Bertrand Russell created, one of his key students is a guy named Norbert Wiener, who is one of the key prodigies of Russell at Cambridge. And Russell has his, Principia Mathematica or Principia Scientifica trilogy of books, where his idea in 1913 is, let's mathematize the universe. That's what the Principia essentially tries to do. Now, if you do that, obviously you're an idiot, because the universe is not mathematical. It doesn't work that way. It's a creative, nonlinear place. But so he tries to do it, and people like Einstein's buddy Kurt Gödel prove that can't be done, and pretty much prove that the entire magnum opus Principia series is worthless. And that's done in like 1931. He just destroys it, and it's a huge embarrassment for Russell. But Russell's students still carry on the project, which is find a practical way of mathematizing humanity and create a science of control. So Norbert Wiener is the one who comes up with the science of control during World War II, and it becomes called cybernetics. And the idea is, it's modeled on the idea of the helmsman theory of a boat, right? Only the helmsman needs to know what the boat is doing. Everyone else just needs to be hyper specialized. And so that is what is done after, you have the Macy Foundation conferences on cybernetics in 1945, 46, 47, that are funded also by the Rockefeller Foundation, the same groups that were funding eugenics. They're now seeing that this is the key way to recapture the countries that had just defeated Hitler, because the Hitler eugenics project didn't work. They had to abort. So they changed the name eugenics into some different names, but with the same effect. And the instrument to carry out that process of implementation was cybernetics. And that's what took over NATO very quickly. So NATO was immediately the OECD, under people like Alexander King, who later goes on to found the Club of Rome, is a major cyberneticist who reorganizes and heavily bureaucratizes these institutions so that only a few people in executive points are allowed to think about what the whole machine does. Everyone else are essentially lobotomized. That's how most people are in the system. They're instruments of the conspiracy, but they themselves have no clue what they're part of. And that becomes part of the education reforms of the 60s, the new math systems that got rid of the teaching of the classics, of Greek, of Latin. All of that was ousted as the obsolete form of learning, right? Old dead white European males is erased. Why learn about those? We have to learn about more relevant people who know about the ugliness and hypocrisy of our age. We're going to learn about them. We're not going to learn about stupid white idealists, colonialists like Ben Franklin anymore, or Dante. And the new math becomes, let's now treat people like they're, cogs in a machine, instead of like integral human beings who will be citizens. We want to get rid of that. So this is what goes into the environmentalist movement, the idea of mathematizing systems that could then be put into computer models and then projected into the future based upon linear projections. That's part of that whole process that really takes off in the 70s. It's what's behind the consumer society revolution of mathematizing human economies in the form of mathematical logarithms that you could then, like, again, project into the future mathematically. It's done in everything. Nothing is untouched. It's done in biological fields in terms of even the big pharma complex that's set up in the 70s is using the same technique to try to treat life and biosystems as if they're just effectively computers. And it's done in psychology, which is where the cult of artificial intelligence grew out of as well. The idea of machine learning, and that machines can compute faster and thus render human minds obsolete, because human minds are just computers anyway. but much more limited because we can't be as fast. So that's what's behind transhumanism. It's what's behind the Davos cult of, the fourth industrial revolution. And that's what effectively was brought into China by Zhao Ziyang, Soros' stooge, who co-ran a think tank with Soros, and he was supposed to be the Yat-sen of China. So whereas this grouping was more successful in the 90s in Russia at stripping down and undoing Russia and with perestroika, in China, where Zhao Ziyang was supposed to become the Trotskyite type, dictator under a democratic veneer of China, that the spark plug that was supposed to put him in there was a color revolution sponsored by the CIA, the NED, called Tiananmen Square.
Dang.
And Tiananmen Square was not a massacre by the Chinese government. When you actually look at the evidence, this was a Maidan, 2014 style Maidan with hardcore bloody terrorist cells working with the triads and the CIA and MI6 that killed something like 40 PLA soldiers who were never allowed to be armed. It was terrible, but the point was it didn't succeed. Whereas things like the Philippines color revolution did succeed at that time, ousting Marcos. Marcos' son is back in power, by the way. But Zhao Ziyang was ousted, put under house arrest for the rest of his life. His collaborators were either arrested or they escaped to the United States, where they became a foreign fifth column in exile, working to undermine China from the outside. This is what people like Miles Guo, who works with Steve Bannon, is a part of. This is what's probably behind. I haven't done a lot of the work, but I'm getting a sense that this is what's behind things like Falun Gong, Epoch Times, things like that. It's this entire, agency in that have been waiting to try to overthrow the government of China and put themselves back into power, as sort of, again, like what they wanted to do with Trotsky back in the 20s. They want to do that now there. Or what they did with Yeltsin back in the 90s. That's what they want to do with China. And they want to split it up and balkanize it the way they did to a lot of the former Soviet bloc countries. And that's also what they're trying to do with the plan to kill Putin. And then, Zbigniew Brzezinski has these diagrams of like 12 micronations of Russia all under the control of the IMF. So all that to say, that's the, in the briefest form, that's sort of the story of China. And
it's interesting too, is it's like you gave us it's like not only are these some of the architects, obviously, of the New World Order, but it was like you were getting into the guts of globalization, it felt like, right? Like when you think about like the early 70s, and then you start to talk about all those different institutions, groups from the early 20th century, but as you brought it forward, it just felt like the guts of globalization. And are we like over it yet? I think a lot of countries and people obviously are. Can we wake enough Americans up to figure out that we've been just as much at the effect of globalization as anybody else? Yeah, maybe now they'll get it.
Well, I think the charm is wearing off pretty fast.
Yeah, especially when we can't even like travel as freely. I mean, we'd love to have you come to America, but we can't get you over. I think about going back there. I saw where you live in that San Martin. It's such a beautiful little area. And it was like, God, I'd love to go there. I've never been in that area. It's really sweet. It looks
someday sooner than later, hopefully.
Well, it looks charming anyhow, like even though you're in the heart of the beast, but we all kind of are. Like anybody that's paying attention could say, well, it's right in my backyard. Well, it is. That's the truth of it. But our neighbors could be, enlightened a little bit if we can find a bridge. I think that's part of it, right? Just finding bridges to other people to open their minds to
exactly. No, I think
you didn't know as much as you thought you knew. That's a good place to start.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I think just starting like that and just being amplifiers, and just getting better and better at being instruments of God's will. And, that just means being conduits. And the more you enjoy it and find your pleasure doing that, I think the universe will resonate accordingly. And if humanity, I hope that we have the wits within us to respond to the call, before a dark age hits. And I mean, we are sort of in a cultural dark age in many ways, but there's still windows that will close for a few generations if we don't act sooner than later. So I do hope that we don't miss these opportunities now while we still have them. If not, I mean, we still know you could always go to bed and sleep soundly knowing you've obeyed your conscience and obeyed God, and you're on the side, God's on your side, you're on God's side. And And I think ultimately, I don't want to overthink it. I think when people overthink it, they get stressed, they psych themselves out, they get depressed. And it's like they lose the ability just to like live in the moment, which you kind of have to do in a healthy way. Oh, I lost you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
I feel like I froze. Oh.
No, we're just listening.
Oh yeah, okay.
No. I mean, I think like we are the light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of people. So if people feel like, hey, this is like the worst times and everything's going to hell in a handbasket, the truth is no, there's plenty of time. Most of us are going to be recycling back anyhow. So it's like, let's make the best of what we got right now and really go for it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, like whatever the case may be, the fact is, I mean, some people say, okay, we reincarnate. Other people have the view that no, we go to heaven. Some people have, I mean, the point is, I think everybody who I trust generally has a sense that their identity is located in their soul, that their soul is good and it's immortal, that the other part about us that is mortal, and ultimately, you know, is unfinished, is not really who we are. You know, it's like the spiritual leads the matter, and you always want the health of the soul to come out, and the soul could get sicker, it could get healthier, but you always want it to get healthier and take your joys and priorities and values from that standpoint. And from there, you know, when you look at things like how it was that the Roman Empire, this satanic, over-bloated empire of hardcore occult networks and brutalizing, you know, behavior and I mean, look at the stories of what went on the Colosseum for generations, right? Where people were just watching innocent men, women, and children getting eaten alive, getting killed by gladiators, and it's brutalizing and it's exploitative for all of the countries who are not part of the capital, or who are not the favored races. So it was a brutalizing place. But despite that, you know, you had this Christian movement that was able to resonate and amplify itself according to just the very simple principles of loving thy neighbor, loving yourself, and loving God accordingly. You know, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and know that your soul is ultimately going to be most healthy by you doing good, despite the fact that your physical body might be discomfortable or uncomfortable, or even killed despite that. And you could die happy, and you could probably, you know, if you're lucky, you might even live to see the end of the Roman Empire. And a lot of Christians did see the Roman Empire, like St. Augustine. And it's a joy to just read St. Augustine and just see how he's struggling, but also joyous that there's something higher that is slowly coming on into being, the city of God, you know, that he's writing about, which we stumble, and we've been stumbling, but we're always coming into greater alignment with that city of God that in you know, the world. And that's the American Revolution. That's what's behind the writings of people like Ben Franklin, and that's what's behind the Golden Renaissance earlier of Europe, and that's what's behind every great upshift of the Bandung Conference of the principles of peaceful coexistence. I mean, that's essentially the city of God. If you look at those principles written by Eastern leaders back in the 50s, which are animating the entire foreign policy outlook of the multipolar alliance today, it's those 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. It's the Augustinian city of God, effectively. So it's there.
Yeah, and actually, in some ways, we are being over here in the West. We are like that, like St. Augustine a little bit, because we're seeing the end of something happening right now. Obviously, it's breaking down, and even the whole left-right paradigm is losing its effect on a lot of people that got caught up in it. And that's good. I mean, just the other day, who was it? We saw, because there's that woman did that movie on Alex Jones, right? Called Alex's War. So you're watching Glenn Greenwald do an interview with Alex Jones and what's her name? Alex Lee Moyer. So she they just released this film. They premiered it in Austin. And Glenn Greenwald shows up and interviews the two of them. And it's just brilliant. You got all these different people, left, right, center, however you see it, but they're all finding a common ground. And I thought it was really inspiring.
Awesome. No, I'll check that out. I didn't, I saw it. I didn't actually.
I mean, I haven't seen the movie. They're talking, it basically just got released to theaters. It actually made it to the theaters. It's a documentary about Alex Jones. This
Wow.
woman went to do he even says, he was like, well, you don't always put me in the best light. And she was like, well, I was trying to be honest. And he was like, well, I'm glad you did. You know, like he's using it as a place to basically say, yeah, I'm not perfect. And I did a lot of dumb stuff in my early life and I'm trying to learn and be better. You know, it's just interesting because I was never a big fan. But at the same time, I saw what he stood for. I saw what he was pointing out. You know, he's got his own flavor and his own audience. But I thought that's a bridge of the right left paradigm that is just such a psyop that's been put on us.
Yep.
I mean, it
Absolutely.
really is. I mean, obviously, you know.
Yep. It is. So what are we going to talk about next time?
I
meet
love
up?
it because now we're set up to really get into FDR.
Yeah,
Like
that's
now
right.
we laid the foundation because
Right.
I think it was important, you know. It
Yeah, there was that gap. It's true. All right.
and there's just so much rich stuff that you just got into. And I just love seeing the continual reflection back to the 700 to 900 period, that Renaissance, where again, we saw Muslims and Christians and Chinese and the Jewish Turkish energy all trying to work together. So I just keep seeing this opportunity again and again for more peace, progress, and prosperity. And it's always the same kind of energies that seem to be wanting to infiltrate it in various ways.
Yeah.
And I mean, right now, I don't think there's been a time in history like right now that's exposing it. 30 years ago, you couldn't even find books that were talking about. Now, with the Rising Time Foundation, you can go to your Library of Alexandria and find all kinds of good literature. There's a good plug for you.
Amen. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm glad we didn't like skip over anything because I think it's really important to see like all the different strings, like, right, like just music, like it creates a chord, you know, like of being able to really study how long these things have been going on and how long there has been resistance and how much progress and peace and prosperity that could be still, and understanding how like we got in our own way or other people got in the way so that we can really like get ourselves back on course. So I'm into this. Let's keep going.
All right, me too. Yeah, absolutely. I really like you guys. You guys are great.
We have a blast.
We really enjoy you,
Yeah,
and
we have a
Cynthia,
blast.
man. I'm learning so much.
Hey, Cynthia is doing something really great. She just published a piece on Bandung more in depth. She goes so thorough into Bandung. And she's going to do a lecture this Sunday for the Rising Tide. Or no, this is going to be a Canadian Patriot lecture. But if you guys want to do, I'm sure she'd be happy to sit down with you guys. I'll send you the essay she did. It was published on the Saker. I think it would spark a really fun conversation with you guys.
Okay. Yeah, we need to do that.
No, we'd love to get with Cynthia. I read all her stuff. Everything she sends. I don't miss an essay because they're just so packed and filled. And I love the way she breaks it down. So we'd give her plenty of time to lay it out. I still want to do her with, you know, I know
Huxley. I know.
Yeah, I know she did. I know she did those
Huxley
on
one.
I know.
Huxley.
We might
So
start there.
so tell her we might start actually
Start there.
there.
Start there and then move. Okay. Whatever you guys want.
We've got big plans.
Well, because I know she did a couple, you know, she did that one interview with Mel K about the Huxley series, but I just think there's more to unravel there. I mean, those 4 essays are packed.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to unravel. So if she's up for it, we're totally down.
Yeah.
I'm sure she'd be excited to talk about this.
Sweet.
All right, guys.
Hey,
thank you so
have
much,
a wonderful night, man. Thank you very much. God bless you, brother.
Guys. All right. Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
take
See you
care.
next time.
Peace.
Oh boy,
Gotta pee.
No, my legs are on fire. I got bit like 5 times. I caught the mosquito right. Yeah.
There's one. I know I got bit too. I just was toughing it out. Fuckers. Oh my gosh, that was fun. We did it again. Good one. I didn't smoke for shit though. Cuts into my smoking time. I tell them that.